Well, hello there, and thanks very much for tuning in once again to ARTEFACT Storytelling Live with me, Scott McArthur. Just a few words of thanks from last week. It was, as some of you know, it was the first time I'd ever run a live event and of this type, and I've been blown away by the feedback. Not only did I get feedback about what I said, I also got feedback about how I did it, the lighting that I used, the interaction with the technology, etc., etc. So I'm really touched, and thank you ever so much. So let's get on with this week. And I think the thing that stuck out for me last week, and it definitely resonated with you if the feedback is anything to go by, and that is that there's something about facts that they may tell, facts may tell, but actually it's the story that sells. And I didn't set out, I've always known that phrase, it's been in my head for years. But I think on reflection from last week, I think that is really what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to answer some of the more difficult questions that people have about, why is it that people don't respond to facts? Why is it that things like alt facts, mythologies, etc., are very powerful in our cultures? And what does that mean for our day-to-day lives? So that is really interesting that came out. I'm pleased it resonated with so many of you, and I promise that we'll build on that as the weeks go on. So this week, what we're going to do this week? Well, this week is really about the hook, the beginning of the process. How do you get somebody into your story? How do you get somebody to actually engage with your story? Now, this is something that I gave you a little hint at last week when I mentioned one of my talks, which was about this. If you weren't here last week, I said, I stood on a stage and I said, I'm going to tell you a story about my grandfather's foot. And I paused and I looked around the room and I could see people's eyes going like this. And they were clearly thinking, he's going to talk about his grandfather's feet. And I wasn't. I was going to talk about my grandfather's foot of letters that he wrote to me over 30 years. But I noticed in that moment that I had them. There was something about that moment that really got them. And I think it's only been in the last few years that I've really started to study story to really try to understand it. And I think this part, right at the very beginning, is possibly the most important part. Now, there's an odd thing as well there where, yes, I can see you. Thank you very much for the comments already, guys. Thank you. I'll come back to those. There's something about that first few seconds that if you as a storyteller, and remember the other thing I said to you last week is that everybody can tell story, everybody can tell good stories. It's just you have to practice it. And I think that first 30 seconds or that first 10 seconds even is the part that we have to really think about. Next week, I'm going to talk about what is a story, because I think that often is misunderstood as well. But I will come back to that next time. So let me get into this and to give you, why is it from the very first sentence that the reader must want to know more about what you're going to say. Now, this doesn't matter if you're talking about a corporate story or a piece of poetry or anything else. It's about any type of story that you tell. And for me, that's something very, very important. So let me give you some examples. And I've written some down here. Here they are here. Now, my children are young, and they like the Spot books. And in one of the Spot books, Spot's a little dog, and there's a book called Where's Spot? And in the very, very first sentence of one of those books, it says this: "Look, that's Spot's supper. Why hasn't he eaten it? Where's Spot?" Now that, from a very simple little story, starts us off really beautifully with why it's important to get this first 10 seconds right. Because you need to think about what that does to you. So please think about it now. What's it making you? What's it making you think? What's it making you think? You're thinking, okay, there's food under the ground. Spot normally, I think, I've got to make an assumption, Spot normally would eat that up quickly, but Spot's not there. So right away, the moment is pregnant with intrigue, even with a kid's story. Now, the second one, I love this, and this is one of my kids' favourite Christmas tales, and it's from Charles Dickens. And how it starts is, Marley was dead to begin with. I think that's utterly brilliant. Marley was dead to begin with. It's absolutely fantastic, and I think that it captures you with intrigue and with thought and with all sorts of other things in your head going, what is going on? It's so pregnant, and it's pregnant with change. Because there's a mystery there. There's a mystery there. And this is what one of the writers in this piece, a chap called Will Storr, says. You know, the beginning of a story has to be pregnant with change. And if it's pregnant with change, you're going to grab these people. You're going to capture them. So how does that sound so far? I'm just going to check that people can hear what I'm saying. Can you let me know, people, if you can hear me okay? I know you can hear the music, but if you could just confirm that everything's okay, that would be very, very helpful. Yes, thank you. That's great. For those of you who weren't here last week, 2 weeks ago, we launched this, and there was a little problem with one of the devices, not at my end, it was at LinkedIn's end. And I've spoken to some other LinkedIn Live people, and they've had a similar problem. So it was partly me, but not all me. Anyway, so there's another one that I'm going to use, and this is one that I think will give you a little template that I would like you to think about, a little template for you to think about. And as we go into the next week and we start to talk about, you know, what is an actual story? What is an actual story? We'll come back to this little template. So already, just in 2 weeks, we've thought about, you know, facts may tell, but stories sell. Anyone can tell a story, and you should be thinking about being an archaeologist of your own life. But this is a little 3-part model. I was tempted to do a 4-box model, but I'm a former consultant, so I'm not going to do one of those. So that's a bit of an in-joke for consultants. But so this is a story beginning from a lady called Elizabeth George, and the book was called "What Came Before He Shot Her." Even the title's quite intriguing, isn't it? So here, I'm going to read this because I want to get it absolutely right. So Joseph Campbell, 11 years old at the time, began his descent into murder with a bus ride. Joseph Campbell at 11 years old, began his descent into murder with a bus ride. I've just realised I've chosen a quote with the word murder in it, and I've got a Scottish accent. I didn't mean it, but anyway, it's fine. So that's Elizabeth George's introduction to her story. So what are you thinking with that? Can you just sit back and think, okay, what's going on in that little sentence? So we know his name. That's the first thing. So who is the story about? The story is about Joseph Campbell. Yeah, the story is about Joseph Campbell. Then it says, okay, what's beginning here? What's happening here? And this is where there's intrigue. This is where you're thinking, wait a minute, he's a murderer, but he's only 11. And what's he doing on a bus? So already there is this moment of unexpected change. You don't expect an 11-year-old to be in the same sentence as a murder. So there's the first two things. So there's who's it about and where's it going? What's it about? And what's the third and final one is, what's at stake? Well, people are going to die. Right from the very beginning of that story, you think, gosh, people are going to die. And at that point, Elizabeth gets you. She's hooked you. She's hooked you. So I'll remind you what it was again. Joseph Campbell, 11 years old at the time, began his descent into murder with a bus ride. His descent into murder with a bus ride. So that's a beautifully crafted opening sentence. The other two I've given you were pretty good as well, and I do love the Dickens, Marley was dead to begin with. But I think this one is a much more classic structure, which I would like us to come back to. But remember the 3 steps here, folks. There's 3 steps. So, you know, who's the story about? What's beginning here? And what's at stake? That is a beautiful structure to start a story. Now, let me just see what people are saying. Loud and clear. Excellent. That's the sort of feedback I like. Meg, thank you very much for tuning in. Joan, thank you. Samantha, Vindy, how you doing, mate? Nice to see you. So with all of this, we've already got to a point where we think, okay, we need to capture people in the first sentence. But here's some slightly, I mean, I find this quite disappointing at times. Have you ever wondered why, whether beautiful writing or storytelling, are they the same thing? Well, I don't think they are, because there are writers, and now forgive me if you like this writer, I'm going to pick on him because he's easy to pick on. Dan Brown. Famous for writing the Da Vinci Code and all the other mysteries and chase stories, etc. Dan Brown is an absolutely terrible, objectively, a terrible, plodding, opaque, ponderous writer. Sell millions and millions of copies. Sorry. Now, when you first think of it, you think, well, are people just stupid, or what is going on here? How do people like Dan Brown? And there's the 50 Shades woman, I don't even know her name, but another example of terrible writing. But there's something about the way that they write that people can't resist. Now, there's a phrase I'm sure many of you have heard, and that is, oh, it's a right page turner. Well, I was thinking about the Dan Brown book, the first one, the Da Vinci Code, just the other day there, when I was thinking about an example of a poor writer who could tell a good story. And he's a classic, because in that book, and I'm sure many of you have read it, it is almost like a car chase. It started, hold on, sorry, I'd left one of my other machines on there, sorry. It is like a constant car chase, but you get sucked into it. You want to turn the page because you can't resist it. You get yourself to the end of the book and you go, meh. And it's got like all these dead ends and all these ridiculous characters. They'll be walking down the street and they'll say, I am walking down the street. It is that ponderous. Thanks, Meg. I think, I'm glad you agree with me. But it's mind-blowingly badly written. But the beauty of it is that Dan knows how to hook you. He knows how to say Marley was dead to begin with. He captures you with the Langham character. Is it Langham? Can't remember. I think that's his name. He captures you with him, and you want to know what happens to him. He wants you to know, and you cannot help but turn that page. So for me, that just exemplifies that storytelling trumps beautiful writing any day of the week. And in some ways that gives some of us hope, because I would never profess to being a beautiful writer. I try very hard to be a good writer, mainly in the video format and mainly on stage. But it takes me a long time. I'm not the sort of person who can sit down and actually create a good piece first time off. Like, for example, tomorrow, I'm speaking tomorrow, my first live event tomorrow that I've done since lockdown. It's a very small event, as you would imagine. But you know what? I'm really, really nervous, because I haven't done any face-to-face presentations for 3 or 4 months, which is part of it. But also, I've been learning a lot about structure and about storytelling and about video and everything else. And I've been trying to really reflect that in what I'm doing tomorrow. And I must have spent, for a 45-minute talk, I've probably spent about 12 hours on it. I don't do that these days. That's not something I would ever do, but I've really been careful about how I start that story, and I want to catch them. That story bit that sells is the bit that I really, and I'm not selling anything tomorrow, I'm just trying to inspire them, but I want them to be inspired. And the way I'm starting it tomorrow, hopefully, will enable me to achieve that. So anyway, any questions? I am correct. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Olivia. Meg, with a thumbs up. That's really, really helped. Is there another writer you can think of who is a terrible writer but a great storyteller? Another one that does these, maybe the Patterson books, the murder mystery books. I'm definitely saying murder a lot this week. I didn't plan that. I like another writer that I think he's a better writer than Brown, but is Ian Rankin, who writes the Rebus books. And these are stories about Edinburgh. and a detective who called John Rebus, who he actually lives in Fife, lived in Fife, which is just over the water, over the bridges to Fife. He lived there initially, then he moved to Edinburgh. Now, there's a couple of things in there that I think we'll come back to. Well, I know we're going to come back to. I like his stories because they are page turners. But the other thing in there is, there's a good example just come up, Doug. Thank you. I'll come back to that. There's another thing about that story with me personally, because not only does he write a story that is, a page turner. You want to know what happens to Rebus, and he gets beaten up quite a lot. He's not a very good fighter for a cop. But the other thing is, I used to live in Edinburgh, and the emotional attachment I have with that city, despite the fact that I've left Edinburgh 20 odd years ago, you wouldn't know from my beautifully, carefully elocutioned accent, of course. I was from north of the border. But the emotional resonance with his storytelling is very important to me. And I think that's another example of, it's not quite bad writing, because he's obviously a pulp writer. He writes lots and lots and lots of stories. But nevertheless, there's an emotional resonance as well as a good storyteller. So we will come back to the emotional resonance. I might even do that next week when I tell you about what actually a story is. So Doug's mentioned Gormenghast. Oh, yeah, Gormenghast is I don't know if you would call it fantasy fiction. And yeah, I agree. It's difficult to put it down, but it makes absolutely no sense when you get to the end of it. So it's a pretty good example. Callum, you've said Dunderhead. Dunderhead, that's me. Oh, yes, I am a Dunderhead. Sorry, can't help it. The other thing is, of course, Rebus is a Hibs fan. I'm a Hearts fan, so I've got issues with Rebus as well. But anyway, Gormenghast is one that I have read, and I've even watched the TV show. And you're right, it's something you want to get to the end of. But actually, it's a bit like a lot of the Terry Pratchett stuff as well, where I find it's like very public schoolboy writing. But nevertheless, I want to read it. I don't know what it is about it. It must be that he hooks me in with these little stories. This doesn't just happen in the fiction world. Fiction is important, and I will, in 2 or 3 weeks, I'm going to talk about what is fiction, because people actually get quite caught up in this. And there was a recent debate between a chap called Sam Harris, who's a neuroscientist and a very good podcaster. And if you're interested in a deeper type of podcast than most, Sam Harris is Making Sense podcast is terrific. And he was having a conversation with the one and only Jordan Peterson, and they got lost. They were speaking past each other because they were trying to have dialogue on what a story actually was, what a myth actually was, and the impact of it. So I'm going to park that for now, but I will come back to it, because I think it's one of these areas that people really need to think about. They really need to think about it, and why. In all human cultures. Now, I mentioned cave paintings last week, and all across the world we've told stories. It seems to be hardwired into us, and I think the fictional part of it is much misunderstood, particularly in the business world. I think we get very tied up in the business world about the facts tell part of that equation I gave you at the beginning, rather than the story sells. And I think there's a reason for that, but I'll park it and come back to it in a couple of weeks' time, probably. But there's one last thing that I just want to re-emphasize, and it's about, I've been talking about fiction, and I've been talking about, fiction you would read for pleasure. There are different types of fiction, but there's also writing in the business world that stands out. And unfortunately, we lost one of the great storytellers a couple of weeks ago, a chap called Ken Robinson. Now, if you've never heard of Ken, if you ask me to list my top 10 presentations ever that are on the internet, my top 5 are Ken Robinson's TEDx talks. They're utterly brilliant, and he is an absolute master at blending facts into stories and telling a little, like a story about Paul McCartney or about some nonsense that he was doing when he was a child, and how that taught him the importance of movement as well as education, and dance as well as learning and everything else. He's a brilliant storyteller. So before I do my little artifact story, I would just say thank you to Ken. And if you've never heard of him, guys, Ken Robinson, you go into any of my streams on any of these platforms, you'll see Ken Robinson, because I'm a huge fan. and I think he's well worth looking at. So I'm going to tell you my final story for today. I'm just going to check on the other platforms to make sure no one's trying to send me a little message here. No, we're okay. We're okay, I think. Right, thank you for that, guys. Thank you, Andy. Thank you. Another Andy. Who's that? I don't know who that is. But thank you. So this week, I'm going to tell you a story to end that, again, like the one I told you last week. I told the Dementor story last week. I found this an incredibly useful story. And the artifact that I've got for it is this. Now, this is obviously a microscope. And those of you who have heard me speak before will know that I quite often refer back to my time as a research scientist. And these were a very formative part of my life. And I worked mainly with microscopes, not that type. That's what's called a light microscope. I was working with these things called confocal microscopes, which were incredibly powerful, like focused laser light. You could actually focus them inside tissue that wasn't dead. You could focus into a live creature and look inside. It was utterly astonishing. But the story there, it changed my life, and it was one that I will never forget. And this is the story. Every 18 months, when you're a research scientist, you get a call. And I got my call, from my professor. His name was Professor Dougald Gardner. And Dougald he died about 18 months ago, Dougald, and he died, I think he was in his 93 or something. So he was a grand old man. And even when I knew him, many years ago, he was retired. But like many professors of medicine, they never really retire. And he called me into his office, and he said, right, I've got a job for you. And I was like, right, fine. He was always giving me things to do. And he said, I'd like you to go and teach collagen chemistry to third year medical students. And I was like, oh, now I knew my collagen chemistry. That was one of my subjects. I wouldn't say I was an expert, but I knew a fair bit about it. And at all, but I'd never spoken publicly. Well, I had at university in front of my colleagues and spoken about things, but never done it to an audience. One that was that smart, third year medics, and two that were basically the same age as me, and there was 300 or 400 of them. So it was a fairly daunting experience. And that was just for the students. I turned up, I had my lab coat on. It was a bit of a badge of honour to have a lab coat with blood on it. I don't know why, but I had my bloody lab coat, walked in and started to teach. Now, I knew my collagen chemistry, but for the next, and the lecture theatre was astonishing, because it was like you see these Frankenstein movies where they have the almost, it's like a funnel shaped lecture theatre, and you're down there. It's where they used to do the dissections in Victorian times. So there I was in the pit teaching these 400 students collagen chemistry. Oh, and it was absolutely terrible. I mean, it was shocking how bad it was for them and for me. I just hated it. And I would come off stage, and it was just a little stage every week, and I'd be, sweating, and my hair, I had long hair at the time, and my hair was all stuck to my neck, and it was horrible. And I was so glad when it was over. So I did the 8 weeks, and I'm in the laboratory. I'm on one of the microscopes, and there's a knock at the door, and it's Professor Gardner's secretary. Could you please go and see Prof? So I went in to see the professor, and he asked me to sit down. And he said, well, how did it go? I was like, now, this guy was quite a tough fella, not to be messed with. He used to make senior doctors quake when he walked past them. He was a real character. And I honestly thought he was going to sack me. And I was only a youngster. I didn't know how to deal with it. So I just said, oh, it was terrible, Professor. I was terrible. I'm really sorry. I failed. I let you down. I did all the grovelly stuff that you tend to do when you're that age, in your early 20s. And he said, okay. Give yourself a grade. And I was like, right. And he said, A to F. And I went, well, Dougal, there's no doubt, his name was Dougald Gardner. There's no doubt it was an F. I failed. I was a disaster. It was terrible. Now, I really thought he was going to sack me at that point. And he had his glasses on, and he always used to wear his glasses a bit like this. He would have them at the very end of his nose like that. And he sort of took them down, and he went, right, can I give you a grade? And I was like, oh, here we go. And he paused for no more than, I don't know, 2 or 3 seconds. And he said, I'm going to give you a not yet. And I was like, what's that? I didn't know what he was doing. Can you guess what he was doing? Can you guess what he was doing? He was giving me a chance. He was saying to me, you know, Scott, you were rubbish, but I think there could be something about how you speak that you could get better at if you practice. So I left the office. I was shaking. I really thought. I mean, I was living in a squat in Edinburgh at the time. I wasn't well paid or anything, but I needed my job. I needed it, and I loved it. So I didn't want him to sack me, and I was trying my best. Anyway, that story went into the mists of my mind for the next couple of decades. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, I'd done some speaking on stages all over the world, really, but not as a professional speaker. And I had just done had an incredible encounter where I'd done my first TEDx talk, funny enough, called "Why Facts Don't Change People." And I called him and I said, could you come? And he couldn't come because he was old, and ironically, his knees, given we studied arthritis, his knees had gone and he couldn't really walk well. So he had to stay at home. But he asked me if I could send a video of the talk to him. So I did. And he was very grateful. And he said, look, why don't you come up to Edinburgh and see me, and we can have a chat about it, and you can tell me about your adventure. And by this time we had developed into friends. So I went up to Edinburgh. He was at that time the president of the Royal College of Surgeons, which is a very historic place in Edinburgh, where they keep all the body collections from things like the Crimean War and all the oddities that you might have seen in circuses in Victorian times. Quite a daunting place, but very interesting place. Got another story about that, which I will come back to another week. Anyway, we went in there, and there's a restaurant, and there he is. He was sitting at the table. His son David met me at the door and took me to the table, and he said, have a seat, Scott. And I had to sit down, and he said, how are you doing? Fine. And he said, give yourself a grade. and I was like, you old bugger, and by this time, he was a friend, so I could say what I liked to him. And I said, you old devil. I said, okay, I'm not giving myself a grade. You give me a grade. Feel a bit gallus. And so he did. He said, Scott, I give you an A. It was excellent. Really enjoyed it. Very informative. Well done. A. But then he did it again. And again, the glasses went from here to here. And he went, again, a couple of seconds. And this is the art of this man and the art of this story, I think. He went, but. And my emotions are kicking in. It's a important story for me. And what he was meaning was, clearly, Scott, you did okay, but there's further for you to go. You can keep pushing. And without a doubt, I'm a way better professional speaker than I was back then. I have kept developing, and it was so that story, I hope it resonated with some of you. It touches on the importance of learning. It touches on the importance of mentoring. It touches on, so I can use it in all these different contexts. Whether I'm in the office talking to an HR professional, or I'm on the stage talking to a big audience, I can use that story to get people hooked into me at the beginning of one of my talks. So I'll leave you that challenge to think about. What are your stories? In the next few weeks, I'm going to open this up, and I've already had 1 or 2 people come to me and give me artifacts that they would like to talk about, which I'm immensely surprised and grateful for. I can't wait for you to be on the show with me. But what are your artifacts? What are your microscopes? What are the things that in your life really, really bring back or bring that you saw I didn't put that on, the emotional resonance that story has with me. These things are important, and I think we oftentimes let them drift. So I'm going to pause, and then I've got a little video at the end, and we'll finish. But has anyone got a question for me that they would like me to think about? And I'm just going to have a look. Yeah, thanks for calling me. Oh, thanks very much, Vindy. I'm glad you enjoyed that story. Olivia, thank you. Okay, what I'll do is I'm going to finish with something. Now, I'm asking you for some patience here. This is only 30 seconds. I'm not asking to do much. One of the things that I've just done, and one of the reasons I got into live broadcasting, not only because of the situation with lockdown and the fact that my whole industry's collapsed, is that I wanted to get better at this communication stuff. And the storytelling part for me is a key part of it. So this week, 2 days this week, I've made a new demo reel. Now, some of you have already seen it. Now, a demo reel is something that speakers use to give to companies to say, look, I'm quite good at this. Could you have me speak at your event? Now, I'm not going to bore you with the whole thing. That's not what I want to do. Remember, this is about the first few moments. So I'm going to end today. And thanks very much, everybody, for coming along. I'm chuffed to bits of so many of you. You've made my day, and I hope you got value out of it. But I'm going to show you the first 30 seconds of this video, and I want you to watch it carefully. Now, if you've seen it before, try and put that to the back of your mind. What I'm trying to do is get you to think about, what did I do? I didn't just come to this structure. This developed organically. Thumbs up and thanks to the one and only Tom Morley here for helping me with this, because he's a master storyteller, and I'll tell you more about Tom another time. He was the drummer with Scrittability. But anyway, I'll come back to him as a genius. But he helped me build the beginning of this, and it's so important that I capture people's attention right at the start. So thanks very much for tuning in. Remember, this week we looked at, that we re-emphasised that, facts may tell, but it's stories that sell. We had a couple of examples from, Dickens and Spott and Elizabeth George, where we looked at the structure of the beginnings of stories. So who's the story about? What's in it? What's going to happen? And then what's at stake? What's starting to happen in that story, and then what's at stake. So thanks ever so much. I'm going to play the video, and I'm very grateful for you all joining me this week. I'll see you next week, same time, same place. Everything we do really has to be time well spent. Who says that virtual events have to be less fun and less impactful than live events? What if we could make them amazing? So this is where I deliver my premier level of service, my virtual keynotes. I can't wait to show you what we've done to create a entertaining and value-laden virtual experience, and not a Zoom apocalypse like this. So this is one of the best books I've come across when you're trying to communicate. Come with me. Thank you, and good night, everyone. Thank you.